Boom, boom. Hey, welcome to the Life Recreated Show. Glad to be with you here on this wonderful Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm so glad that you're jumping on with me. As always, as we get into this show, the Life Recreated Show, let me know when you're coming in from. Let me know where you're tuning in from this evening. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe. Hope you're being healthy out there during this holiday season. I'm super excited about this show. This is probably going to be the last live stream of the year of 2021. And so I am super excited about that. Being able to, jump on these live streams, jump on these live shows, and share this information, share this knowledge with you. It's been a tremendous blessing to myself, and hopefully it's been a blessing to you. Hopefully you've learned something from it. As I always say on this channel, we are all about learning, healing, and growing in the things of God and through the Word of God. And so that's what I was hoping that you got from some of these live streams, some of these shows thus far, is the ability to grow, the ability to heal, and the ability to learn. So I'm excited about tonight's topic. This one was it was an interesting one for me to write about and an interesting one for me to study about. But I'm excited because I think it's a topic as we kind of continue what we've been talking about. It's a topic that I think needs to be brought up, obviously, and it's going to be interesting to kind of dive in. And I'd love to hear your feedback if you are watching the replay of this. Like I said, this is the Life Recreated Show. I'm Nick. Definitely subscribe. Definitely hit that like button if you're getting some value out of it. Share this with somebody else. And then drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Let me know what kind of questions you have. Let me know what your thoughts are. This evening, I got somebody checking in from Suffolk, VA. My good brother Brian. We actually interviewed him a couple weeks ago. So definitely good to see and hear from you, my brother Brian. So we're going to jump into tonight's topic. And like I said, I'm excited about this. We have been talking about the traits of a spiritually abusive leader. And, before, when we actually even just kind of started talking about this issue of spiritual abuse, the preface to this was we were talking about how to identify spiritual abuse when it's happening in the church, where it's happening from our leaders. And then so we kind of looked at that as an overall picture. We looked at the different signs that we can see and the different things that we can experience in a spiritually abusive situation in a spiritually abusive church. And so I wanted to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on this section of it and actually look at some of the traits that you would find in the actual leader themselves, because we got to understand, as an organization or any kind of organization that we operate in, a lot of times the leader and how the leader operates, the things that are going on within the heart of the leader, the things that are going on within the mindset of the leader, they're going to dictate a lot of the culture of what we experience in a church. Me being a previous pastor and being in that role and experiencing that, I realized that a lot of the things and a lot of the ways in the culture that the church kind of revolved around really depended on where I was at. A lot of times, in my spirituality, in my mindset, and in my heart. And so that's why I thought that it was imperative for us to look at the overall picture of what it looks like, but then take it a step further and start to kind of pinpoint some of the things and the traits that we can see in the individual leader. And my hope is always with this, and like I say in most of the shows, is to approach this with a heart of grace, right? We're trying to approach this with a heart of grace. Every single time that I put a piece of content out, or every single time that I talk about this subject in particular, it's never to point out, or it's never to belittle, or it's never to put someone down, but it's coming from a heart of grace, in the understanding that as believers and as pastors, as leaders within the kingdom of God, if we can learn what these things are, it's going to help us to avoid some of these pitfalls and to just be more effective as pastors, as leaders, for the kingdom of God. And so that's where the heart of this really comes from. So I want to jump into tonight's trait. And like I mentioned, this is going to be the last one of the year, and then picking it back up in 2022. But I want to talk about tonight's trait of a spiritually abusive leader, and that's the struggle with insecurity. We're going to talk about the struggle with insecurity and why this was such an interesting thing to kind of learn about and kind of dive into is, the realization that we all struggle with insecurities, right? We all struggle with insecurities. If you think about it, in any aspect of life, I don't care who you are, what you've gone through, what you've experienced in life, we all struggle with some type of insecurity. And so this is something that not only is an area that we can see how it impacts leadership, but this is also an area that we can see that probably impacts every single person, maybe even watching this right now or watching in the future. Insecurity is something that we're all going to face. And so as we jump in, I kind of want to look at, three different things that I thought about when I thought about the issue of insecurity. Like I said before, you know what? Number one, everyone has insecurities. Everyone has insecurities. I mean, as I was preparing this, I was talking to my wife last night. We were having a conversation. Things came up, and I realized that there were insecurities within my own life that came up within that conversation. And so it was like a light bulb that said, you know what? Every single one of us on the face of this earth, we all have insecurities that we deal with, right? We all have things that we struggle with and that we battle with. The second thing that we got to remember and keep in mind is this, that every leader has insecurities. So if everyone has an insecurity within their life, that would tell me that every leader that we see, every person that we see in a position of, maybe a pastor or maybe a leader in an organization or in a church, we got to understand that they're going to have insecurities themselves, and that's fine. God says there's nothing wrong with us having insecurities, like I mentioned, because we all have insecurities. And then the third thing with insecurities is this, is we want to look at and we want to understand, though, how insecurities can impact how we interact with others. See, I think that when we really boil down this issue of insecurity, the key is to know, okay, yes, we all have insecurities and we're all struggling with those different insecurities. But the real question is, how are those insecurities that we have, how is this impacting our relationships with other people? And how is that affecting how we interact with people? Because like I mentioned before, when I was speaking to my wife and having a conversation, I realized that my insecurity that I had, that I was sharing with her, is impacting our relationship. There's some type of impact there, and it's not necessarily an issue of her fault, but it's an insecurity that I have that is going to impact our relationship. And so when we look at this issue of spiritual abuse, and when we look at this issue of leadership within the church, we have to realize, and we've got to just accept the fact that our insecurities, at the end of the day, they're going to impact how we interact with other people and how we go about interacting and dealing with our relationships. And a lot of those things are going to come out of our insecurities. The other thing we got to think about when we think and take it a step further is this, is that insecurity in leadership, it always, a lot of times, can impact how a leader leads, and especially how they treat others. So if we look at the example there, right, the insecurities that I may have as a leader and the things that I may struggle with are going to affect the way and my perspective on how I lead the people that I'm entrusted to lead. And it's also going to impact the way that I treat those people, right? It's going to impact the way that I talk to them. It's going to impact the way that I handle them. And it's going to impact the way that I deal with those that are entrusted in my care. And so this is why it's so important for us as leaders to understand, number one, what our insecurities are, right? Number two, to accept the fact that, yes, these are the insecurities that we may have as men or women in a leadership position. But number three, most importantly, is to not let those insecurities get out of hand and go unchecked, because that's where we run into the dilemma of spiritual abuse, is when those insecurities that a lot of us face and deal with go unchecked, and they impact how we lead others and how we interact with others. And so I want to start with, I think, a story in the Bible that, a very familiar story, very familiar issue. But I think that this story, when you kind of look at this story and you kind of look and understand the dynamics that were happening between these two men, we can understand how insecurity plays a role in basically just impacting how we lead. And we can also see kind of some of the damaging effects that has. So this example that I'm using actually comes out of the story between King Saul and David, right? And this is First Samuel chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 6. And I just want to read a snippet of this, but I think that when you look at this story and you kind of really read the context of this story, this part right here is where I believe the insecurity that Saul really dealt with as a leader and struggled with as a leader. I think that this is where it went unchecked and led him into becoming an abusive leader. And if he would have been able to check this earlier on, it could have really salvaged a lot of his leadership, and it could have salvaged his relationship with David. So let's read this together real quick. Like I said, First Samuel chapter 18, starting at verse 6, it says this: when the victorious Israelite army was returning home from David, or returning home after David had killed the Philistine, right? This is David killing the Philistine, killing Goliath. The Philistine women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals, right? So this is a celebration. Things are going, things are happy. We're celebrating. We defeated this this huge Philistine that was causing all these problems. But then the story goes on to say this, that Saul, this is what the women were singing. They said, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. Verse 9 says this: so from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Now, you know, a lot of us, we've seen this story, we've heard this story before, but I believe that this is where Saul ran into the issue of his insecurity going unchecked. And I think that this is a good example and a good story to help us to understand what can happen in the life and in the heart of a leader when we have insecurities that arise, because we all have them. We have insecurities that arise, but more importantly, when those insecurities go unchecked, the damage that can happen and that can occur because of us not checking our insecurities. So think about with me for this evening, what happens when we have insecurities that go unchecked. I believe that there's three things that can happen in the life of a leader when insecurities go unchecked. And it leads us to three things. Number one, it can lead us to jealousy. Number two, it can lead us to distrust. Number three, it can lead us to paranoia and fear. So jealousy, distrust, paranoia, and fear. So if we were to think about this, and if we were to really examine this for a moment here, we would come to realize that in the life of a leader, if these are the three things that are operating in our lives or operating in our hearts, if you will, jealousy, distrust, paranoia, and fear, you know, anybody with some common sense would realize that if that goes unchecked, right? And this being a leader, if those things go unchecked because of insecurities, we got to understand the damage that's going to happen and that can occur from those different things going unchecked in the life of a leader, right? Well, because if I'm jealous of everybody that can be around me, or those that may be coming up, or those that may, and in this case, we seen God was raising David up. So as a leader, if I see God raising another individual up, and because of my insecurity, jealousy begins to start arising, you know, we can see that that's not going to lead to some good things. Even in our text, if we kind of take it a step further, right, we see where this issue of jealousy comes from. First Samuel chapter 18, verse 9. It says this: so from that time, this is after Saul heard these women, you know, screaming and yelling and singing David's praises. It says, from that time, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Now, look, let's be honest. If anybody's ever been in a relationship, one of the most damaging things, one of the most damaging emotions that can destroy a relationship has to do with jealousy, right? It has to do with, you know, us looking at or comparing or thinking or wishing or hoping that we could be in a different situation, or this person that maybe is kind of coming up with us could be in a different situation. So as a leader, when a leader starts looking at, okay, those people that God may be raising up, God may be lifting up, and this is the case with David, as a leader, if I don't check my insecurity, one of the emotions that I begin to struggle with and I begin to deal with is jealousy. Now, a lot of times, if we be honest, I mean, I don't know how many people would actually, willingly admit and say, hey, I'm jealous of this person, or I'm eyeing this person. I mean, in our text, and what the Bible was saying is that Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Saul began to start watching David, begin to start, looking at David, and begin to start, kind of always, just keeping this watchful eye on David. And that came out of an emotion of jealousy. So when we see in a spiritually abusive situation, when we see this issue of, men or women that are in leadership that are dealing with this issue of jealousy, we see this watchful eye that begins to start to form. Now, if we think back on some of the traits and some of the things that we can see in that identify spiritual abuse, right? My logic would think that if a leader's struggling with jealousy, then that means that, and give me a kind of, even we look at it in this text, if a leader is struggling with jealousy, we're going to see that there's always going to be this want, and it's going to be this need to keep an eye on the person that we may be jealous of. And then what does that lead us to? That leads us to wanting to try and somehow control behavior, somehow wanting to control different aspects and different areas that maybe that person operates in, and that person maybe functions in. And so as a leader, I mean, I've looked at other leaders. I'll be the first to say it. I've looked at other leaders. I've seen other leaders. I've seen, maybe God raising up other people, and that jealousy can begin to build up in us and say, hey, well, why is God lifting up or raising up this person and not me? Right. And so what ends up beginning to happen is this spirit of jealousy, which is what Saul began to struggle with. And we see it happen in the trait and in the life of a spiritual leader that does not check this insecurity. Jealousy begins to start taking root and begins to start taking hold. The second thing that we see that happens is we see this issue of distrust beginning to happen, right? So in our text, we kind of go back to it. Verse 8, it says this: after Saul had heard the women yelling David's praise and yelling his name, it says that this made Saul very angry. He said, "What's this?" He said, "They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king." So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. And the key thing that we got to look at right here, right? Because this is what I think is that jealousy a lot of times will lead to the distrust, right? Because look at what Saul said here. He said, look, these people are giving David all this credit. He says next they're probably going to make him king. They're probably going to make him king. And this is where he was fearful of. So you think about the distrust that happens there, because if we read kind of like the whole context, the whole story, and the whole backstory of the relationship between David and Saul, I mean, David was the man that was going out and he was handling Saul's issues on the battlefield. I mean, if anybody there was that you would probably want to have and have a trustful relationship with, it would be probably David, because of what we've seen that he was doing on the battlefield, right? But because of Saul's insecurity, now instead of Saul being able to, be able to have that right relationship with David, it led him to distrusting David and thinking in his mind that, what, one day David is probably going to be king. Well, obviously we know now, looking at the story and kind of, knowing the backstory of it, we know that David did become king. But here is an issue where we see, Saul looking at David and then beginning to distrust David, which is probably the person that he probably should have trusted the most. This is probably the person that he probably should have said, you know what? I want to have this person at my side all the time, because I know that if I can trust David and I can send him out into the battlefield, I know that he's going to be able to help us and help the kingdom to grow. But when we see a spiritually abusive situation and we see a leader that does not check the insecurities that may arise in his heart, we see these issues of jealousy begin to take root. We see these issues of distrust that begin to take root, right? And when we look at it and we look at our text, we see how that can be something that damages this relationship. And we're going to see later on the aftermath and the effect of what ends up happening. And then the last thing that insecurities lead to is fear and paranoia. Fear and paranoia. Now, look, fear can make us do some stupid things, man. We can be scared of some stupid things. I once heard, the acronym that fear is, false expectations appearing real. And so here's the same issue that ended up happening when we see it. See it happening here to King Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 12 says this: Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. Now, my issue and the thing that I get so sad about, even in this story, is the fact that, when we really look at the story of Saul and David, right, we see the fact that, we see the fact that with Saul's insecurities and his distrust and his jealousy towards David, we see how, Saul realized that God was with David. But then the sadder part was that God had turned away from Saul, right? God had turned away from Saul. So now we got to think about, if we're looking at pastors, if we're looking at leaders, if we're looking at those that are in spiritual authority in those positions, if our insecurities go unchecked and they begin to develop and lead into us being, jealous and distrust and leading into this paranoia and this fear, we can see here how damaging it is and how sad it is when we allow that fear to take hold of us. And I think, when we look at the whole issue of spiritual abuse and we look at, the impact that it has, I mean, one of the constant themes that we've seen in identifying it, one of the constant themes that we've seen in the different traits of a spiritually abusive leader is this issue of fear, this issue of fear within our hearts, or fear for things that aren't really real. They're not really there. And a lot of times those fears, they end up causing leaders to do things, say things, act in ways that end up hurting rather than helping, right? And from our text and from what we can see in this trait, we can see a lot of times that's just rooted in our insecurity. And so here's the result, and this is where it becomes so damaging, is because this insecurity, like we seen in that last text, the insecurity is possibly what undermined how successful Saul could have really been. If we look at like Saul's life, how God selected him, where he could have went, the things he could have accomplished, even though he accomplished great things as a king, I mean, his story could have been a lot different if he was able to check insecurity. And so when we see it happening in spiritual abuse, we see the fact that, we see a lot of times where, very high level pastors, high level spiritual leaders, there's these insecurities there that go unchecked and that cause and that are become the root of all these different things of distrust and jealousy and fear and paranoia and all these different things. And it ends up basically short circuiting probably how successful a man or woman could have really been if they were able to check that insecurity, if they were able to look at that insecurity and say, you know what, I know that this is an issue that I may have in my heart, that I may have going on within me, and I need to take that issue to God so he can help me deal and sort out that insecurity within my life and in my heart, right? So Saul could have probably went so much further. He could have went so much further in his success as a leader, but because that insecurity went unchecked, it led to that distrust, it led to that jealousy, it led to the fear and the paranoia. And then lastly, and this is where I think it plays a part in what we're facing, is that, these issues and this insecurity ended up causing pain and distress in the life of David. So here you have a man who, we know the Bible says was a man after God's own heart. It was a man that obviously did these great things for King Saul, for his army, right? This is a man that said, "Hey, I'm here." We know when you read the story of David, him and Jonathan, which is King Saul's son, were like one. They were friends. They were, I mean, closer than brothers. And then, you have King Saul, because of his insecurity and because of the things that he's struggling with, it ends up impacting the relationship that he had with David and ends up hurting David and causing a lot of distress. When we think about spiritual abuse, and a lot of times, and this is why I brought this subject up and decided to even start with this topic when we kind of dive into the things happening in the church. I mean, one of the most painful things that you can really look and realize is some of the after effects and some of the damage that can occur um, at the hands of a spiritually abusive leader, right? Some of the things, there's a lot of times where people don't make it back to God. They don't make it back into the house of God. They don't make it back to that relationship that they once had with God, right? I know people personally that are still, dealing with it and struggling with it and trying to figure out, hey, how do I take these steps back to God because of what I've experienced or what I've felt or what I've dealt with at the hands of a leader, right? And I look at David and I look at his life, and yes, David was, God obviously continued to keep using him, continue to keep blessing him, and to keep, continue to keep prospering him. But you got to think about how much that affected him. When you read on into David's life and you read on into this struggle and this battle that he had with, running into Saul and knowing that he could take Saul's life, and just that struggle and that tension that he felt of, like, man, like, this is a guy that I was willing to let him lead me. I was willing to be accepting of whichever direction he wanted to lead me. But yet, because of his insecurities, the pain and the distress he caused me, you got to think that this is an issue that a lot of times becomes the byproduct of, someone that deals with spiritual abuse, right? It becomes the hurtful and the pain that you deal with spiritual abuse. The Bible tells us, even as we kind of read on a little bit more on this, of the distress and the pain that he realizes, that, in verse 28 through 29, it says, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life, right? So here's a man that it probably didn't have to happen like that. It didn't have to happen to where David and Saul, instead of them being able to, do the things that God had wanted to do for his people and for his kingdom, instead of them having to be at these polar opposites for the rest of their lives, it probably didn't have to end up like that. But this is the dilemma that we face a lot of times when that insecurity goes unchecked, right? And so I think as we look at spiritual leaders, we look at pastors, and we look at these different insecurities that a lot of us definitely face. I think it's so important for us as leaders to realize and recognize, okay, yeah, this is an insecurity that I have within my life, and own up to it and say, hey, look, this is it. This is something that I struggle with and something that I'm dealing with in my heart, right? And something that I'm struggling with in my heart. And if I don't get a hold of it, and if I don't ask God to help me to be able to overcome that insecurity and really be able to push that insecurity aside, or learn how to dominate that insecurity rather than that insecurity dominating me, it ends up leading us to a place where we can become abusive and then end up hurting those that God has placed in our life really to help us, right? And vice versa. God's placed these people, men and women, in our lives for us to help them to grow into the things of God, and then vice versa for them to help be a blessing to our lives. But a lot of times, if we're not able to grab a hold of those insecurities, the result can be so damaging. And it's a trait that I've seen personally, I've experienced it, and even in my own life, right? And I think that's why it was such a challenge and a struggle to even, understand this and really take the time to sit down and think about it and write about it, those insecurities. And so that's the trait that we're gonna see, and we're gonna see it happen. There's a couple great comments on here. Brian, he says, "Hey, paranoia and fear. Hey, that's a real thing. Paranoia and fear, I think, is a real thing. We see it in the life of Saul. We see how paranoid he was because of David, and it shouldn't have been like that. Shouldn't have been like that. And so, my encouragement to you this evening, if you're out there, you're listening, maybe you're a pastor, maybe you're a leader, maybe you're, within the congregation. Look, we all are going to definitely struggle with our different insecurities. We all are going to face these insecurities. We know that this is a part of life. But I think that, as leaders, we ought to learn how to take hold of those insecurities, hand them over to God so that he can make us effective leaders. He can make us effective leaders and have the impact in the lives of the believers that we definitely want. My brother Brian here says good stuff. It's definitely applicable to life in and out of the church. In and out of the church. Like I even mentioned at the beginning of this, and talking with my wife in marriage, how many times does insecurities come up there, right? Insecurities that we face and that we struggle with in our relationship with friends and families. There's all these different insecurities. And so it's a trait that we can see that can definitely be an impact. And it's something that as leaders, we need to be able to grab a hold of and to really just conquer and really dominate within our lives. And so that's what I have for you this evening. Hey, if you got a question, if you got a comment, I'm going to stick around just for a few moments to answer those. We got some really good stuff coming up next year, man. 2022, I believe, is going to be a phenomenal year. I've been working on things and thinking about things. I've got some great interviews lined up for the show that I think are going to really help maybe people that are going through, different things and dealing with different things. Obviously, in 2022, we're going to move beyond, dealing with spiritual abuse. I know this is what I wanted to touch on and really start with. But in 2022, planning some different things on maybe a course on healing and helping to heal those that may have been trying to walk through these things and, taking those next steps to healing. And so we got those definitely coming out. Like I mentioned, some great interviews coming out with leaders, with different men and women that have maybe experienced this, that have been in the church, that have been longtime leaders, that can help give us some great perspective into the Word of God and really help us to really find some healing and really to grow. 2022, I think, is going to be a great year of growth. I think it's going to be a great year of healing, and so I'm excited about what it's going to be able to bring to us next year. Let me know if you got any questions, any kind of comments you might want to throw out here as I check this comment page before we hop off. Someone on Facebook, I don't know how to, it's a lot of times I don't know. I can see a Facebook comment, but I don't really see who it's from. And I like that, Brian. I appreciate that. I appreciate the show. I appreciate you and everything that it's going to be able to bring in 2022. I think it's going to be a wonderful year. So I'll leave it with that. Like I said, this is going to be the last live stream show of 2021. I'm excited about what 2022 is going to bring. Moving into this next week, next couple of days, man, enjoy some time with your family, enjoy some time resting. Oh, there we go. Okay, that was Pastor Keith. Thank you, Pastor Keith. All right, my friend Pastor Keith over there. Hey, that's a great text. He had mentioned and made a comment earlier. It was a great text for this pastor, so that's great. I appreciate that. And so, like I said, going into these next couple of weeks, man, enjoy some time with your family. Enjoy some time before we get started in 2022. And I always just want to encourage you. We're just moving forward. and learning how to move forward, learning how to learn. We're learning how to heal. We're learning how to grow. And so this is Nick with the Life Recreated Show. Until next time, when I see you in the new year, continue to be blessed, continue to learn, continue to keep healing, continue to keep growing, and I'll catch you next year.